Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on the impact of social emotional learning on students with childhood trauma. Your presenters today are Kennedy Onell and Garrett Giblette. Before I introduce the both of them, a few key reminders to please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole presentation, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the hour. So feel free to use the chat box for any comments or questions. As I mentioned, your presenters today are Kennedy and Garrett. Kennedy is a first-year school psychology student on the BCBA track at the University of Utah. She is currently a behavioral specialist for the SEN team in the UTTEC lab. Garrett is also a first-year BCBA track school psychology student. And he is currently a behavioral specialist with the UTTEC Labs Climbs team in Granite School District in Salt Lake County. Welcome, Garrett and Kennedy. It's great to have you both here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annie. Okay, let me share my screen. Terrific. Thank you all for being here. Like Annie talked about, today we're talking about the impact of social emotional learning on students with childhood trauma. So let's get into it. By way of overview, we're going to be talking about what trauma is, what social emotional learning or SEL is, and then what are some trauma-informed SEL practices. By way of disclaimer, this presentation does cover some heavier topics such as abuse and trauma, which some may find triggering or difficult to hear. So we just wanted to put that as a viewer discretion advised at the beginning. CAMH, or the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Canada, has a terrific definition of trauma that I think really fits our purposes today. They state that trauma is the lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety, sense of self, and their ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. So immediately we can kind of have this framework of understanding trauma, its effects, and then what we can do about it, particularly in schools. By way of history of studying childhood trauma, we're going to be referring mainly to what's known as the Kaiser Permanente study, this massive 2-year detailed study into what are known as ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. This study, which had over 17,000 participants, really helps us better understand what exactly are the traumatic events that an individual may experience through their childhood, and then kind of better understanding and having a very specific framework of how to cope with that. And of course, today there are many organizations, research groups, and companies that also study childhood trauma, which can be very helpful in deepening our understanding of what trauma is and its impact on individuals. A really, really helpful way of understanding childhood trauma is to break it apart into 4 specific categories. These categories include abuse, neglect, household challenges, or other adversity. In terms of abuse, there are 3 specific kinds that we look at: emotional, physical, and sexual. Neglect, we have emotional and physical. Household challenges, which aren't necessarily something that the child themselves are doing, but rather the environment, the house in which they are growing up, what their caretakers are doing, and this includes substance misuse, mental illness, divorce or separation, incarceration, domestic violence. And then, of course, other adversity that a child may experience, such as bullying, community violence, natural disasters, refugee or wartime experiences, and or witnessing or experiencing acts of terrorism. So this is obviously childhood trauma is a broad term that it can incorporate a lot of different ideas, but this is a helpful way of kind of specifying exactly what we're talking about when we talk about childhood traumas. It's very helpful as well to understand the prevalence of childhood traumas, not only what it is, but how prevalent they are. The CDC has some pretty sobering statistics about trauma. As you can see here, at least 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death are associated with ACEs. Again, those adverse childhood experiences. 61% of adults had at least one ACE, which is a pretty staggering statistic. And 1 in 6 adults experience 4 or more types of ACEs. So this just shows that understanding trauma is something that impacts all of us. The vast majority of those here in the United States. There are certain risks and impacts associated with childhood trauma. And again, a helpful way of understanding this and framing this is to break it apart into three specific groupings: health conditions, health risk behaviors, and socioeconomic challenges. And of course, as you can see here, for health conditions, that includes depressive disorder, various heart diseases, asthma, kidney disease, strokes, coronary heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity. Health risk behaviors including smoking and drinking, and socioeconomic challenges including unemployment, less than a high school education, and lack of health insurance, which is pretty crazy to think about, honestly, that these childhood traumas can affect so deeply these things that are of major importance to understand and overcome in our society. A helpful way of kind of generalizing all these different things, because it's a lot to kind of take in, but a helpful way to kind of understand it is unhealthy stress from these ACEs can lead to changes in brain development, affect the way the body responds to stress, and are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance misuse in childhood. And one major effect that childhood trauma has is on learning, which is what we will be focusing on today. This effect is hyperarousal over a long period of time, otherwise known as chronic stress, that can lead to neurobiological effects within the brain. And these effects can impede one's physical, social, emotional, and academic development, which is very important then to understand how this particularly manifests in children who are currently or who have in the past experienced varying forms of trauma, and how that shows in their day-to-day life, and particularly in a school setting. To kind of list off some very specific impacts that this has, you have a decreased executive functioning ability, a lower cognitive performance, inability to trust adults, difficulty forming social relationships, challenges interpreting verbal and nonverbal cues, trouble understanding others' perspectives, poor planning abilities, which you could immediately see would be very, very detrimental to a child who is sitting in a typical classroom, trying to learn, cope with a teacher up front, surrounded by their peers, going about a daily schedule, and how these particular negative impacts would be so important to understand because of what would happen to the child within that setting. It's also very important to note that the symptoms and effects that we talked about will differ between various school age groups, elementary, middle school, high school. For those younger students in elementary school and early middle school, you'll see some very specific, unique experiences, such as like an overreaction to loud sounds like the bell or physical touch or the lighting in the school. While as you kind of see these students growing up and getting into their high school years, you'll see some more unique manifestations of their trauma in things like alcohol and drug abuse. And of course, there are things that are going to be universal across all age groups, but it's very important to note when working with each of these individual groups, the specific individuals and students that you're working with, that the symptoms may show in different ways than they would in other groups. Again, very important for educators, for parents to understand and not misidentify these behaviors that may be trauma-driven specifically. A very helpful quote from an article in 2017 says, "Teachers who are unaware of the dynamics of complex trauma can easily mistake its manifestations as willful disobedience, defiance, or inattention. When students struggle to focus on tasks or complete assignments, teachers might interpret it as laziness or lack of motivation. When students isolate themselves, teachers may interpret this as a rejection of their own efforts to reach out, leading them to respond punitively, which only pushes students further into isolation." This can be tricky. This can obviously be very tricky for teachers, for educators who are trying to work with large groups of students. And so it's easy to understand how a teacher might mislabel or misidentify this disobedience or these things that are manifesting in negative behaviors in their classrooms and kind of attribute it specifically to the student instead of the environment and the history that child might have. And so as part of our understanding of this trauma, there's been a big initiative and movement in the United States to create what are known as trauma-sensitive schools, which can be a tremendous source of help for students who are trying to cope with their trauma. A very helpful quote from that same 2017 study on the former slide says, while trauma has a negative effect on learning, learning also can undo that same trauma, or at the very least help these students to be able to cope with what they're experiencing. And we believe that schools are just a tremendous source for understanding what's going on, and then providing that support that these students need. And then, of course, one very terrific and very well-researched resource is what's known as social emotional learning, which Kennedy will now talk about.
All right, so I'm going to touch on what social emotional learning is, the benefits of SEL, and then I'll also be talking about key trauma-informed SEL practices and some of the things we do as the Ascend team at the site we are at. So what is social emotional learning? So if we think about it, emphasis in schools has long been on academic knowledge. If you think about the grading system that's used in schools, it's primarily focused on how well students are doing in academics, like math or science or English. But what about all the other skills that are imperative to student success, such as emotional regulation, empathy, and healthy relationships? So new research actually suggests that if we want students to be successful, not only in school, but in life, we need to promote their social emotional skills. Next one. All right, so social emotional learning, or SEL, is an integral part of education and human development. SEL is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. And this definition was taken from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which is a really great resource that I will touch on later. So social and emotional skills create responsive, caring, and just inclusive classrooms and provide the foundation for building and sustaining learning relationships that lead to academic success and responsible citizenship. Do the next one. All right, so the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning is a really great resource for SEL, and they kind of outline these 5 major dimensions for SEL. So Garrett and I both facilitate and implement SEL lessons at the schools we're at in the lab, and many of the SEL lessons we do stem from these 5 main dimensions. So the first one being self-awareness, which is recognizing one's emotions and values, as well as one's strengths and limitations, sense of self-confidence. The second one is social awareness, which includes showing and understanding empathy for others, ability to take others' perspectives, appreciating and interacting with diverse groups. The third one, self-management, managing emotions and behaviors to achieve one's goals, being able to regulate one's own emotions, conscientiousness, perseverance. The fourth one is relationship skills, which includes forming and maintaining positive relationships, working in teams, negotiating conflict, seeking help when needed. And lastly, responsible decision-making, which includes assessing risks and making good decisions, respecting others, taking personal responsibility for one's decisions. All right, so let's talk about some of the benefits of social emotional learning. So this data right here was taken from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. This data was taken from a 2011 meta-analysis of 213 school-based universal SEL programs. This included 270,034 students, kindergarten through high school, and compared to other students where there was not an SEL program implemented within the school, 27% more of the students improved their academic performance at the end of the program. 57% more gained in their skill levels, 24% more improved social behaviors and had lower levels of distress, 23% more improved attitudes, and 22% more showed fewer conduct problems. So as you can see from this data, there's a compelling case for the importance of SEL in schools. And I'm going to touch more on why SEL is not only important for students, but is also very important for students with trauma. All right, so talking about social emotional learning and trauma. So while SEL programs themselves are not necessarily designed for trauma, most schools that have implemented SEL programs serve significant numbers of traumatized students. So it's important to recognize the impact that SEL has on trauma and ways SEL can be tailored specifically to meet the needs of traumatized students. To a large extent, the basic tenets of SEL overlap with the principles of trauma-informed instruction. For individuals with trauma, ordinary emotional and social skills often are superseded by trauma-responsive survival skills. So things such as defiance, shutting down, struggling with, relational boundaries, or becoming overly self-reliant. Garrett kind of touched on this before, but when a child experiences chronic stress or fear, there's the survival part of the brain kicks into gear, resulting in increased activation of the limbic system and the fight or flight response, and decrease in the functioning of brain areas responsible for information processing, planning, and other executive functions. So this information was actually taken from an article published by Paulo and colleagues in 2019 titled "Why SEL Should Be Trauma-Informed," and this is also a really great resource. All right, so now I'm going to be talking about key trauma-informed SEL practices. So this was taken from Transforming Education. I will discuss each of these practices and then share some of the things I do in SEL within my classroom, as well as the Ascend team in line with these practices. So the first trauma-informed SEL practice is create predictable routines. So often kids who have experienced trauma, they typically come from a home life that isn't stable, could be chaotic, but overall just is not predictable. If every day during SEL and in school in general, there's a set schedule, there are established rules that are consistently enforced and familiar faces in the classroom, this will allow a traumatized student to not have to constantly monitor the situation for risks or potential changes. And this will then help alleviate the constant stress and fear that they may be experiencing. So one of the things we do in our classroom is we have a set of SEL rules or expectations. So this is the set of SEL expectations that we use in our classroom. I can't take credit for making it. Haley Heller, who is also in the lab and at Ascend, created this for the students at the start of the year when I was, learning how to conduct SEL. And I just saw how well the students responded to having these expectations explicitly stated and decided to implement it into my lessons. So at the start of every SEL lesson, we always go over the expectations, and at this point in the year, the kids are very well versed on what those expectations are. It's also important to have a visual schedule reminder of the SEL time and the topic for that week. The teacher I work with creates a visual schedule of the student's day, so they always know what time to expect SEL. She also posts what the SEL skill of the week is, whether it's, communication, self-esteem, handling stress. So that way the students, again, have that predictable routine of knowing what time and what they are learning. All right, the second trauma-informed SEL practice is build strong and supportive relationships. So in much the same way that we're shaped by adverse childhood experiences, we're also shaped deeply by positive experience, which can lead to resilience. Supportive relationships and enriched environments are critical for providing youth with positive experiences that can protect them from the impact of ACEs. Many students affected by trauma will have had caregivers who were perhaps unavailable or maybe unable to provide consistent caregiving. And for these students, supportive relationships with adults and peers are especially important. SEL can allow us to teach and model healthy relationships. Some of the ways we can do that and some of the practices, we do in our classroom are basing activities around how to have healthy relationships. One topic we discussed is how to be a good friend. And some of the activities that the Ascend team did was talk about qualities, that make a good friend, or having conversations around what make a bad friend. Another thing I implemented with the students is doing shout outs. So I would pass a shout out card to each of the students and they would write something positive or something great that they noticed another student did, and the student would receive those cards. I feel like sometimes students with trauma in a school setting are constantly having their weaknesses pointed out or receiving negative attention, especially from peers. So these student shout outs allow students to give their peers positive attention and promote those pro-social skills by thinking about positive qualities they see in each other. And then in turn, this can also help strengthen school community. All right, the third trauma-informed SEL practice is empower students' agency. So although almost all evidence-based SEL programs are centered around the student, only a few give students agency to create and direct their learning. It's important that we find ways to support their goals. This in turn will help students feel seen, heard, and empowered. The content we teach in SEL is important for all students, but especially students with trauma. If we're able to give students some say in what they're learning or doing in SEL, they'll be more likely to pay attention. As we know, kids like to pay attention to the things that they find interesting or relevant to them. They will feel that SEL content is more relevant to them and their own lives, and we can give them effective skills for the difficult struggles they may experience at home. Then hopefully they're more likely to use the skills we taught to them during that SEL lesson if they had some choice in it. Just some examples that we've used at the Ascend team. We taught a lesson on conflict resolution. I gave them the framework for conflict resolution steps, but let the students pick conflicts they wanted to focus on. Also giving them a positive self-talk journal, but maybe letting them choose the entries they wanted to fill out. Another one we did was setting goals. So have the students lay out their goals for SEL for the year by writing a letter to their future self. This way I know how I can best support those goals, and they can also keep themselves accountable for reaching those goals. I also just try to do regular check-ins with the students about certain activities or topics they would like to incorporate, just because I know if they have a choice, they will be more interested. All right, the fourth trauma-informed SEL practice is support the development of self-regulation skills. So youth that have experienced trauma tend to show significant weaknesses recognizing emotions accurately. Many are quick to identify fear and anger, but slow to accurately read neutral facial expressions. So it's important to help the students develop emotional awareness and monitoring. Some of the things we do in our classroom is use a mood meter as a tool to check in with their emotions. Every day when we start SEL, we go over the SEL expectations, and I do what's called an emotion check-in. So we just go around the table and each student rates their emotions on this scale here. Some students really like having the platform to talk about how they feel, and they'll go into detail about the certain emotions they're feeling. For other students, they might not feel like labeling a certain emotion. And that's where the scale comes in handy, because then the students can just look and say, you know what, I feel a 4 today, instead of having to say, oh, I feel anxious. Either way they do it, they're practicing that emotional self-monitoring. We also talk about and implement coping skills to help them effectively deal with heavy and tough emotions. For every student, it's very different on what's calming or de-stressing for them. Throughout SEL, I try to incorporate various coping strategies. Sometimes we'll do guided meditations or coloring activities, or even sometimes going for a walk. We did a whole lesson on the importance of coping skills, how to know when you need to use one, what ones work best for you. And this was so important because good or bad, kids watch and learn how to cope from the adults that are around them. So if you have students that may come from, a not so healthy environment, or, especially students with trauma, it's important to teach and model those healthy coping skills for them. All right, the last trauma-informed SEL practice is provide opportunities to explore individual and community identities. So for students affected by trauma, it tends to be particularly important to create cultural norms that emphasize individuals' existing strengths rather than their deficits. Students affected by trauma often suffer social stigma and may have experienced chronic rejection and other negative consequences, both at school and elsewhere. They also often experience poor self-concept and have difficulty developing a positive identity. It is crucial that SEL and other school culture initiatives include ample opportunities for all students to experience themselves as positive, appreciated, and effective members of the community. It's important to help students strengthen and explore their own identities and perspectives of others through various activities that promote that agency and civic engagement. So some things we've done in our classroom are creating an identity poster. This was so important so the students got a chance to focus and emphasize on the qualities that make them unique and valued, and focus, what makes them special as a person and the strengths that they possess. We also focused on exploring our identity as a community within the school. Something that the students have going on in the classroom is called a warm fuzzy jar. This is where every time a student is caught, doing a random act of kindness or something positive for somebody else, they get to put a little puffball into the jar. And once it's filled to the top, the kids can earn a party where they can have pizza or ice cream. And so continuing to implement that into SEL as well. We also created a positive school culture list one day. The kids worked together as a team to set rules they should follow as a classroom in order to make it a positive and inclusive place. And this was important to give the kids the autonomy in deciding that, instead of me just telling them what I think it should be. So it was important for them to focus on their class identity within the school and work together to figure out what would make that positive. All right, so now Garrett and I will talk about some resources for SEL and trauma-informed education. So the first resource I have is Transforming Education. This is a really great resource for SEL and just other education resources in general. The goal of this organization is to amplify the voice of educators in the field. They integrate research into their practice and educate the field on evidence-based and promising strategies for embedding whole child approaches within the education system. All right, so this was something I talked about earlier, but the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. So their widely used definition and framework for SEL, which is seen in that graphic right there, creates a foundation for all communities to identify evidence-based SEL strategies that are most meaningful to their local context. Their research and learning agenda is also exploring how SEL can be a lever for equity and excellence. They also work with partners to combine rigorous SEL research with practical, actionable findings. They also review and evaluate SEL programs to help educators make informed choices that meet their local needs. But overall, this is just a really great SEL resource. All right, another resource I have is the Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety. They have a lot of different tools, resources, and publications, but one thing that I think is really cool is they have a research-based toolkit that's about 120-minute professional development session designed for educators seeking research-based strategies to create a healthy classroom environment for students who have experienced adversities and trauma, also focusing on this in the context of SEL.
Hey, Garrett. I think your audio isn't working.
Have I just been talking the whole time? And
Yes, I think so. I'm so sorry.
Well,
I think you went through 2 slides. Yep.
that is hilarious. You guys are so patient. I appreciate that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Well, what I was saying, the CDC has a great resource on ACEs with lots of information and resources about understanding and coping strategies that really help. The National Center on Safe Supportive Learning Environments has something known as Safe Supportive Learning, which is really helpful for a school setting specifically and learning environments in general, and ways that individuals and schools and school administrators and teachers can make a school more trauma sensitive and kind of better implement and understand these social emotional learning strategies. And then there's an initiative known as the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative out of Harvard that also has some pretty terrific resources for understanding how to make a better learning environment for those who experience traumas either currently or in the past. And now we'd like to provide an opportunity for those who have any questions or any comments that they would like to talk about. And so we can do that now. Terrific. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. If we don't have any lingering questions or comments, we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Again, one big virtual round of applause for Kennedy and Garrett for presenting today. This presentation is recorded and will be uploaded to the UTTEC Lab website and YouTube channel. For information about previous webinars, please feel free to check out the UTTEC Lab by going to u-tteclab.com. Again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.